Okay. Good evening, everybody. And a few of you have joined since my last update, but my name is Rosalind O'Connell. I'm with Advocacy Solutions, and we're here tonight to support Hereditary Amyloidosis Canada and Anne-Marie Carr, who's the Executive Director and President, or Founder, I should say, of HAC. And we just want to take this opportunity to welcome everybody to tonight's webinar. And before we begin the presentation, I just want to cover off a few housekeeping items. So to begin with, you'll notice on the screen, you will have a dashboard feature, and this webinar is being recorded so that we can archive the presentation and save it to the HAC website. We'll also share a link with those who are unable to join the webinar tonight. And also for all of you who are on the line, if you'd like to go back and watch this webinar afterwards, you can certainly do so. So you'll be notified through a link that you'll receive in the email following this webinar tonight. And since everyone is muted and in the interest of keeping things organized, we ask that you submit your questions by typing them into the question panel on the on-screen dashboard, which you can see highlighted there in red. And if you have any problems at all doing that, then it would be great if you could just send an email to Lauren, my colleague Lauren, at advocacysolutions.ca, and we will do our best to help you with any technical difficulties that you might be experiencing. And just a little note that you can submit a question at any time, but we will be holding all questions until the end of the presentation. We'll do our best to address all of the questions that we receive, depending on how many we get within the allotted time of this webinar, which is set to run until 9 p.m. And if we're not able to address your question during tonight's webinar, then we will certainly do our best to follow up with an answer to your question after. And now we'll get started, and I'd like to turn it over to Anne-Marie.
Oh, hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Rosalind. Thanks everyone for joining us today for our first of 3 webinars focused on advocacy. I am Anne-Marie Carr, Founder and Executive Director of Hereditary Amyloidosis Canada. And as a relatively new organisation, we're pleased to be able to bring this webinar series to our community at this time. But we wouldn't be here today without the individuals and the organisation who so generously support our work. In no particular order, many thanks to AXEA, Alnylam, EIRIS and Pfizer. It's a critical time indeed for us to learn about advocacy and how drugs are approved and funded in Canada, given that we have seen 3 new treatments for hATTR amyloidosis approved in this country in just over the last year and a half. By the end of this series, our community will be ready to engage in advocacy to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible through public funding to all those who can benefit from them, no matter where they live across the country. On your screen, you can see the agenda for today's webinar, and you'll note that we have much ground to cover. But before we begin, I would like to thank the team from Advocacy Solutions for being with us today. And without further ado, I will ask Ryan and Joanne to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ryan Clark, and I am the founder and president of Advocacy Solutions.
And hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Koski. I'm the managing director of Advocacy Solutions, and on behalf of our colleagues, Rosalind O'Connell and Lauren Wu, we are so pleased to be joining all of you for this webinar series.
Okay, so let's start with just this overview slide around the objectives. These are the objectives of the entire webinar series. As you've heard, this is the first of 3 webinars we're going to be doing. And so the first objective is to educate the community itself about advocacy and how drugs are approved and funded in Canada, and tonight we'll begin that process. We, of course, want to empower the community to take action in support of publicly funded access to treatments across the country, and, of course, also to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible to all patients who can benefit. So on each of the webinars, we will revisit and remind everybody that these are the objectives of our time together. So let's just do a very quick update on sort of where things are at. So there are 3 treatments for hATTR amyloidosis that were recently approved in Canada. Tegsedi in October of 2018, Onpattro in July of 2019, and tafamidis in January of 2020. All 3 of these drugs have gone through a process whereby they've been reviewed for public funding, and they've received a positive recommendation. We call it a positive recommendation by the body that initially reviews medications for public funding in Canada. Again, we're going to go through this in a lot more detail on the next webinar, on May the 20th. And as of today, this is where the 3 drugs stand in the current process. Again, a process that we'll run through in a lot more detail when we're together next. So tafamidis is under consideration for negotiation by this body called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Onpattro is currently in active pricing negotiations with that same body. And just very recently, less than 2 weeks ago, pricing negotiations for Tegsedi were concluded between the public drug programs and the manufacturer. And so it's moved on to the final phase of these processes heading towards public reimbursement. You should know that Anne-Marie and HAC have been engaged in these processes to date and will continue to do so moving forward, including in Quebec through the rare disease group there, RQMO. And so with that, just very brief update in terms of where these medications are and sort of why we're doing all of this. Let's turn to the main topic for this webinar this evening, and that is advocacy. And let's start at the beginning with perhaps the most obvious question: what is advocacy? Well, it's verbal support or argument for a cause or a policy. That's a dictionary definition that I'm not terribly fond of. So instead, I describe it, I think, a little more simply as advocacy is telling your story to someone, and the someone could be anyone. It could be somebody in government, it could be your physician, it could be a hospital administrator, your employer, a school principal, it could be anybody, through various means with the express purpose of compelling them to do, or in some cases, not to do something. That's essentially what advocacy is. In advocacy, this person that you sort of tell this story to is what we refer to them as a decision maker. And she or he will be the target of your advocacy effort. So I'm introducing some language here that you're going to hear over and over again as we go through these webinars. The first one being this concept of a decision maker, and that's what we mean by a decision maker. Advocacy is a process that almost normally takes time to realize tangible results. It's not what protesters do when they chain themselves to a tree to prevent it from being cut down or something like that. It's not radical. It's reasonable. It's grounded in sound, reasonable, rational thought and argument. There is no one way to do it. Advocacy is very personal to your own style or your own comfort level, and it is your choice as to how much you choose to engage in a particular advocacy campaign, we call them, or effort. And lastly on the slide, and perhaps to some extent most importantly, advocacy is about empowerment. It's exerting some form of control and initiating some form of action around an issue that matters to you. So why is advocacy important? Well, if you remember nothing else, you simply need to remember this, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's it. That is government, that is politics, that is life, I think. And it's any large institutional or even small institutional setting you may have ever found yourself in. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's how things sort of work. It's also important because if I work in government and an issue comes across my desk and I don't know who you are or I don't know who your organization is, then I will not engage you. You will not be part of the conversation. You will not be part of the process that is undertaken that may dramatically affect you and the people you love and your family and your supporters in the case of an organization. So it's really important. We describe it as making sure that you kind of insert yourself into this process. And along the same lines, it's important because particularly when you're advocating to government, they will do what they want or they'll do nothing unless people intervene in the process. So we describe this as the idea of inserting yourself into the larger process. So we say to everybody the same very simple premise. The choice to engage should be clear. Do nothing, nothing will happen. Nothing will change. Do something, and something may just change. And that's really the essence of why we think advocacy is important for those people who are looking to make change. Different kinds of advocacy. For people new to the world of advocacy, it is often, or actually almost always, personal need that will compel one to take action. You're not looking to change the world, you just want to help yourself or a loved one. But it's out of this personal need that some people start to realize they have an opportunity to bring about larger public policy change by advocating for broadly based issues. And so we describe people like this as having graduated. And what we simply mean is that in most cases, when you enter into the healthcare system or when you're in the healthcare system, you are there focused on yourself or a loved one or the immediate needs that you have. And that makes perfect sense. That's very logical. But sometimes some people who are engaged in this very personal issue look around themselves and say, well, if we're having trouble, that means other people must be having trouble. And if other people are having trouble, then we need to solve this issue, not just for us and our family, but for everybody. And those are the people who develop this ability to see the world beyond themselves and their own immediate needs to something bigger than that. And again, that's why we use the term as having graduated. You graduate from seeing the world just about yourself to something bigger. And the exciting part about this is that the people who do graduate, who do see something bigger than themselves, have the opportunity to not only influence public policy, but we've had the privilege of working with people who can literally create public policy. Where there was nothing, there is now something because somebody took the time to see the world beyond themselves. And quite frankly, the fact that you're on this call tonight tells us that you have seen a picture that is bigger than just yourselves. And so we consider all of you graduates to some extent just by your decision to be here. The essence of good advocacy, this is the foundation. If any one of these elements is missing, you're going to have a difficult time starting to engage in advocacy, let alone get better at it. We do a much fuller presentation of this content that runs about an hour and a half. You're getting an abbreviated version of that. And so we're not going to go through all of this detail, but let's start with the quick discussion of the two pillars of effective advocacy. And they are personal stories and relationships with decision makers. So let's talk first about the first pillar, which is this idea of personal stories. So what is a personal story? In a face-to-face meeting or in written communication with a decision maker, your personal story makes your issue come to life. And in essence, it is a summary, we describe it as, of either your entire life, if you will, up until that point in time, or a part of your life as it relates to the issue at hand. And this is a really important point. Your personal story will have many, many different components to it. And that's fine, that makes perfect sense. But what's critical when you're telling your personal story, when sometimes you only have 1 minute, 2 minutes, probably never more than about 5 minutes, is to make sure that you hone in or focus in part on those elements of your personal story that are linked to the issue at hand. So I'll just give you a very simple example. Part of your personal story may be a challenge in getting a proper diagnosis. Maybe it took you a long time to get a proper diagnosis, for example. But the subject matter that you're there to talk to the decision maker about is access to medication. You can say in your personal story that part of what you faced was a challenge in getting timely diagnosis. But you're not there to talk about diagnoses. So you're not going to spend 2 minutes of the 5 minutes talking about the challenge you had getting diagnosed, even though it may be a critical part of your personal story, because that's not the subject matter of the reason that you're there. The subject matter is access to medications. So while you can mention it, you really need to focus more on, for example, pharmaceutical treatments, if that's what the issue is. And so when we talk about your personal story and the importance of using your personal story to make something come to life, what your personal story does is it makes the issue real for the decision maker, and it provides a point of connection between the two of you. And if properly developed and delivered, your personal story should fuel the logic of your one ask. Joanne will talk about a little bit more about what we mean by this idea of one ask. And the final thing I'll say on this slide is you'll notice that it says it's emotional. It should be emotional. Your personal story should be emotional, but don't misunderstand. Emotional does not mean sad. Emotional means emotional. Emotional is the ups and downs and the various emotions that we all as human beings experience over the course of a month, a year, and a lifetime. And so it should be emotional in helping to motivate and guide the decision maker to what you need them to do for you. But again, it's all of the various emotions that you experience as you move along through your story that should be highlighted. How to tell your personal story? Well, as I mentioned, your ability to tell your personal story is the key to your success, particularly when advocating in person. That's not something we're doing a lot right now, of course, but when it's done, it's key, and it's still important even in the context of not necessarily being with somebody in person. And while we don't have time in this presentation to answer all of the questions on this slide, let me review some of the more critical elements related to personal stories. So when you decide to tell your personal story, you in essence have two choices. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, alluded to this a little bit earlier. You can either tell a summary of your entire personal story, again, as it pertains to the issue at hand. I mentioned that a moment ago. Or you can tell a portion of your story that focuses on one or two aspects of the issue at hand. But you're always connecting to the issue that you're there to talk about. I'm not sure how many of you have ever written out your personal stories, but you really need to do so if you're going to be an effective advocate. It is essential, and we use that word. It is essential. It's essential because we all forget things. It's an ongoing story that you'll always be adding to, so your personal story is always a work in progress. And you're going to need to create versions of your story potentially, as I've noted above. There will be times when you will tell a summary of your entire story, and there will be other times when you'll just tell a portion of your story depending on circumstances. It's also essential because we're getting into a little bit of detail here, but it's important because this is one of the most important pieces that any patient and caregiver brings to the table. It's essential because you are allowed to read it. Again, particularly in this time of not having face-to-face meetings, if you're on the phone with a decision maker, or even if you're on a Zoom call or something like that, you're absolutely allowed to read your personal story. Because remember, it's not a test. It is really a private exercise we're talking about here, or behind closed doors, as we say. So you don't have to be perfect at communicating your personal story for it to be effective. In fact, sometimes reading it can actually be the most impactful way of doing it under certain circumstances. So don't be afraid to read it if you're more comfortable. You don't have to, but in most cases, we recommend that people who are certainly starting out consider reading their personal story. So the essential elements of your personal story, there are 4 elements that should be in every personal story for the purposes of advocacy. The first 2 are pretty straightforward. You want to have some basic personal details and facts around your personal situation, and this is essentially what we call background. You're simply setting the scene for the person who is listening or reading, depending on the circumstances, your personal story. Your key messages we talk about will be included in an issue section of your personal story. They help to explain the problem and the change you need to have made. If you're advocating for a broader issue as opposed to one that affects only you or the person that you're caring for, these key messages they'll support your key messages. In other words, it's important that whatever it is that you're delivering, whatever it is that you're saying, is supported by your key messages, and your key messages obviously need to support in turn. If you're advocating for yourself or a loved one on an individual level, then your personal story will contain your key messages. So again, if it's just about you, your key messages will be in your personal story, and if you're advocating for something more broadly, then your personal story will support your key messages. I hope that's clear. I haven't confused anybody. At every point, you want to make sure in your personal story, and I alluded to this a moment ago, that you convey your feelings about the details or the events that you're describing. You're not just setting out facts. You have to imbue these facts with emotion and how you felt. So if something happened, then you say, and this is how it made me feel, or this was the impact that it had on me. As well as solutions or suggestions to achieve your one ask, which must also be included in all of this work. So in order to help to facilitate people's ability to create their personal stories, we have come up with something called the 5-minute story challenge. And again, I'm not going to read all of these questions, but they're there for your reference. But just sort of a few things to talk about quickly. We can't really emphasize this enough. Your personal story needs to be focused. All of the details and descriptions need to illustrate your issue and lead to your one ask, which again, Joanne will elaborate on in a moment. Making sure your story is always on topic and relevant can be a challenge, even when you've only got a short period of time in which to tell your personal story. And so that's really why we created the 5-minute story challenge. If you can't convey your story effectively in 5 minutes, then we suggest you ask yourself these questions and make the changes needed to essentially tighten it up, to make it more focused. You should know that in our experience, although no one gets their personal story down to the essential elements delivered in 5 minutes on the first or even on the second try, if you keep trying, you will get there. This is a process, and it can be a challenge to get it right. The good news is once you've got it down, you've got it down, and you've got what you need, and you can move on, subject to, of course, additional events that happen in your life, because as I said, your personal story is an ongoing tale, if you will. Now let's review the second pillar of effective advocacy. Not as much content here as there are as personal stories, and that's building and sustaining relationships with key decision makers. At the heart of effective advocacy are what we describe as impeccable relationships with key people in government or other relevant institutions, depending on to whom you're advocating. And remember that again, as I mentioned earlier, it almost always takes time to realize tangible results through advocacy. And that's because relationships are so important to the process. And logically, it takes time to build good, solid relationships with people of influence. But if you cast the net widely enough, and again, I'm referring to advocating in government here as my example, if you cast the net widely enough, someone will know someone who knows the decision maker you need to get to. It's not 6 degrees of separation, but typically much less in Canada. In other words, if you are advocating to government decision makers and you think, I've never done this before, I don't know anybody, how could I start? Well, the truth is you're not that far away from them because you're just not. We live in a country with a very small population relative to the structure and the kind of government we have. And so you're probably closer than you think. But it does take patience, being at the right tables, as we say, with the right people, staying engaged, and more than anything, not getting discouraged and giving up. But sometimes you have no relationships, as I mentioned before. So we're often asked, where do you start? What do you do when you have no relationships? Well, in addition to some of the suggestions you see on the slide, let me add that it's never too early to start building relationships with decision makers. In fact, ideally, you start to build those relationships even before you need their help. And so it's all about making that first connection and then using that connection as a stepping stone to further connections, leading all the way to building a relationship with that decision maker who has what you need. And of course, we also assist people to figure out who is this person, for example, in government that I need to advocate to. And so we tell people, don't miss a chance to communicate and don't stop communicating. You should always be communicating in the context of building relationships with people. Now, let me hand it over to my colleague, Joanne, to take us through the balance of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. So now that we've covered the fundamentals of effective advocacy, let's walk through the 5-step process that you as individuals or as a collective group can start doing right away to develop an actual advocacy plan that you can then implement in support of your issues. So this is the practical stuff. We're finished with the theory of advocacy. Ryan walked us through all of that. And we want you to know that while this part does not require substantial resources, it does require time, which we know typically can be a challenge for some people. Maybe not so much right now. We have lots of time on our hands, many of us. But as well as requiring a commitment and a willingness to start and stick with it. So step 1, identify your issues. The initial question that you really have to ask yourself is, what are the problems, concerns, challenges that you face individually or as a group? Try to articulate the answer to this question for as many issues as you can identify. And not all issues, importantly, lend themselves to advocacy. And one important thing to note on this slide is that the issues that do not lend themselves to advocacy are still issues. You just can't solve them with advocacy. So take this test. Can the objective be achieved through advocacy, and can a target be identified? And as Ryan mentioned earlier, a target, just to remind, is the person or entity that can bring about the change that you need. And they will be the focus of your advocacy efforts. So step 2. The key to this step is really to be able to narrow down and frame complex issues so that they are manageable or consumable, if you will, from an advocacy perspective. Then it's decision time. You're going to have to choose one issue to begin with, especially if all of the issues that you've identified have the same target. Because in our experience, you really can't have multiple campaigns running, advocacy campaigns, with the same target, because you will risk getting nothing. So, moving on to step 3. Politicians as a group tend to know a little about a number of things and are required to deal with many different issues every day. And this requires you to simplify as much as possible the issues that you put before them. But it's important to note that we don't mean dumbing down the issues or the language. It means conveying the core elements in a compact manner. And that is why, step 3, we develop key messages as a foundational exercise in advocacy. And identifying your key messages requires you, as you can see on this slide, to do 3 things. 1 requires that you can take an array of information and distill it down to its simplest form, as we said, conveying the core elements in a compact manner. It requires that you separate fact from fiction. Very important that your key messages are based in fact. And when advocating on behalf of a group, you must come to a consensus on the issues. And we mentioned that earlier. So, framing is the next part of step 3. And your key messages should absolutely tell a self-contained story. They will be very unique to your issue and to your circumstances. And they may evolve over time, depending on what happens with your issue and what happens in the world around you. We've certainly experienced that over the last few months. So in framing your messages, you're going to develop, we would suggest, 3 key messages that explain the salient points of your issue in simple language. Each one should be, if you can, 25 words or less, and that is not an easy thing to do, we can tell you that from experience. And they must always be clear, compelling, concise, and consistent. We call these the 4 C's. So importantly, we would recommend that you practice presenting your 3 key messages to someone who has really no knowledge of your issue or little knowledge of your issue, and that will help you to see whether you've achieved your objective in framing these and making them concise and easy to understand. So at this stage, you may well be able to determine your famous 1 ask that you keep hearing us speak about of your advocacy target, which we will go through on the next few slides. But first, let's look at a model that we use at Advocacy Solutions. This is one model. There are many different versions of this model for helping organizations like HAC to develop key messages for use in their advocacy work. So we break these messages down into 3. The problem. So quite simply, what is the issue that you've identified that needs to be addressed? What's wrong with the situation, what needs to change, and why? And this message we talk about as the hook that draws people, whether it's a politician or maybe a reporter who you're telling your story to, into your story. Secondly, the solution. And this is how to solve the problem, the changes that will make things better or different. If you go to a politician with just a problem and not a solution, you'll lose their interest. And the same can be said for a reporter if you're telling your story to the media. So the solution really is what makes your story newsworthy to either of those 2 groups of people and keeps them engaged. And then finally, the call to action. And this is the behavior that you need to solve the problem, what you need people to actually do, the action that you want them to take. And importantly, this message links to, or in many cases, incorporates your 1 ask. In advocacy campaigns, we typically build a set of overarching key messages that are used by advocates at the organizational level. And because of that, they tend not to be individual or personal in nature. But those key messages, and you can see an example here on this slide, can and should be used by individual advocates as well. But they can be reframed in that case to reflect the advocate's personal experience or personal story. And we'll talk more about how to do that in webinar 2. So here are the advocacy messages on this slide that HAC has built for the current work that they are doing around access to treatment. And I'll just read through them quickly with you right now. So the problem in the situation of access to treatment is as follows. For the first time, new therapies have been developed that treat the underlying cause of hATTR amyloidosis. And despite being approved by Health Canada, these treatments are not yet accessible through publicly funded drug plans for patients who could benefit from them. Very clear, this is the problem that we are facing today. The solution, given the significant unmet need and the importance of patient choice, those who have been diagnosed with hATTR amyloidosis must have access to all Health Canada approved therapies to slow the progression of this life-threatening disease. And finally, the important call to action. We urge provincial and territorial governments to ensure that all Health Canada approved treatments for hATTR amyloidosis are accessible through immediate public funding. So now that we've covered key messages, let's move on to step 4, determining your one ask. We say 1 because you are going to ask for only what you need and not a list of what you want. And especially when you're advocating to government, if you ask for everything, you will risk getting nothing. As Ryan mentioned, it's very, very important to stay focused on the one thing that you need, even though you may need more than one thing, but in this case, less is definitely more. So determining your one ask requires you to make choices and potentially reach a consensus with those who you're working with, just like you needed to do when you were developing your 3 key messages. And it's also important, as we mentioned earlier, to try and build your ask into your call to action key message, because that will help you to ensure that you're able to deliver it. So the most important thing that we want to stress on this slide is that your ask must be tangible and not things like support or help, because it's very easy for a politician to offer their support or promise to help you as a way to make you believe that they are giving you what you have asked for, but really they're just helping you to leave their office a little bit more quickly or to get you off the phone. So, and finally, we arrive at step 5 in your plan development, your advocacy tools. Now, they are the means of delivering the messages, quite simply. They are anything that you have or produce that may be used to communicate with people is a potential tool in advocacy. And really, it's an infinite group of tools. In our work, we see advocates and patient groups come up with new advocacy tools all the time, out of necessity, out of creativity. So really, you know, there is no limit as long as they will serve your purpose of helping you to communicate your messages. We break down using your advocacy tools into 3 steps, as you can see on the slide. And regardless of the issue or the target, our suggestion to you is that if you skip steps 1, educate, and 2, demonstrate, and go straight to advocate, you won't be as effective in your advocacy work. And even if you go through the first 2 steps quickly, you will have a better outcome and engagement in your issue. In webinar 3, we're going to look at some of the tools on this slide in more detail, and we'll discuss how and when to use them. But here you see an idea of what we consider to be tools in advocacy. And some of these are going to surprise you. There's things like websites, you know, a letter, an email, a text, even a brochure that gives information can be used as an advocacy tool. And many of these tools will actually be available to the hATTR community very soon, if not already, to use in your work moving forward around the issue of publicly funded access to treatment. So that's as far as we're going to go for tonight. We've covered a lot of ground, as we said we would earlier. And we have 2 more webinars coming, so we're going to continue on. But right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Anne-Marie Carr, who's going to conclude for us.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Joanne, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I believe we're off to a great start with this important series and empowering our community to take action in advocacy. Please note that this webinar series is being recorded and each one will be posted on our website for viewing later. Keep an eye on our Facebook page for the links to the recordings. And now we do have some time for questions. So I'm going to pass this back over to Rosalind to read out some of the questions we've received from participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. And just a quick reminder for anyone who would like to submit a question to do so using the question box that's on your dashboard. And our first question today that has come through from the group is a question around, what steps do we need to take to make advocacy effective? So if I would like to advocate, what are those steps that I need to take to do that, and how do I become an advocate?
So we've sort of walked you through the essence of what it is that you would need to do. Part of it depends on whether you want to advocate for yourself personally or whether you want to advocate as part of a larger group. Irrespective, though, of whether it is on a personal level or on a larger level, you really just need to follow the steps that those 5 steps in particular that Joanne went through. Those are the steps. You sit down, you have to figure out your issues. You have to focus in on one particular issue because you can't advocate for 6 different things simultaneously. You have to figure out what you want to say about the issue. Those are your key messages. You have to figure out what it is that you want to ask for relative to the decision maker. And then you have to figure out how to communicate your key messages. And you do that through your advocacy tools. So those really are, in essence, the steps that we recommend. It's always the starting point in any work that we do, those very basic steps. Now, again, in the case of the work that we're doing, much of this for HAC is built. We know what the issue is, the first issue that we're going to focus on, access to treatments. Joanne took us through the key messages. They're basically built. And so we're now talking about joining HAC to deliver some of these key messages, to utilize some of the tools that we have to deliver the key messages to these decision makers with the ask that we talked about. But on a personal level, you would go back and do this exercise yourself, depending on what it is that you wanted to advocate for and to whom you wanted to advocate as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ryan. Another question that we've received tonight is, what is the best way I can relate my personal story to the ask?
So, yeah, we talked a little bit about this, but that's a good question. So sometimes your personal story will relate directly to the ask, and sometimes it will relate less directly. And then here's what I mean. I'll give an example of what I mean about that. So let's say that the ask is to fund these medications, which is what we're talking about here. Now, if you are somebody who needs access to one of these treatments, you've been advised by your physician that you could benefit from one of these treatments, but you haven't been able to get access to it, or you would rely on public funding because let's say you don't have private drug coverage or this kind of stuff, then your circumstances, your personal story, I need access to this drug or these drugs, will relate directly to the ask, and therefore please provide publicly funded access to these drugs. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. On the other hand, you may be somebody who already has access to these to one of these medications through your, say, private drug coverage. You may be somebody who has not progressed along enough to need access to one of these medications. Your physician hasn't recommended that you're yet there in terms of needing access to one of these medications. And so your personal story would be a story of, well, I'm already getting access to one of these medications through private insurance, or I haven't yet been told that I may need access to one of these medications. So in that particular case, you can still bridge to the ask, because the ask doesn't change. The ask is still that they be publicly funded. And you could say something like, in the case of I'm getting it through private drug coverage, while I'm able to get it, my ask is that it be accessible to others who aren't in my circumstances, who aren't able to get it through private drug coverage. And so you ask on behalf of the larger community. Or in the case of somebody who hasn't yet had the medication, you could say, although I haven't been prescribed the medication yet, I'm here to advocate for myself and others that ensures that these drugs are publicly funded if and when I may ever need access. Okay, so your personal story doesn't always have to be spot on with the ask, but there's always a way to take your personal story and bridge to the ask in a way that can still make your engagement very meaningful and very powerful.
Thank you. Our next question here is, what do I do when there is a no response or a negative response when I'm telling my personal story?
So we don't often find that there is no response or negative response to personal stories. I'm not going to say it's never happened. But when we find personal stories are not having the impact that they could have, it could be for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because the personal story isn't as tightly focused as it could be or should be under certain circumstances. Sometimes it's the way in which it's delivered, or the circumstances in which it's delivered. And I don't mean that necessarily from the perspective of the person telling the story, but it can be a number of different factors that will influence how a decision maker receives a personal story. There is no question that some decision makers are more or less impacted, if you will, or affected by personal stories. That's true. And I have seen people who are not moved by them. If they're not, they're not. There's really nothing you can do. Your personal story is your truth. And so you can't make it any different just because it isn't having an impact on somebody, or they're not engaging. But the truth is that this doesn't happen very often. A well-crafted, well-delivered personal story almost always at least gets the decision maker focused on what it is you're there to achieve. Again, it's not going to necessarily move them to say, oh my goodness, as a result of what you've told me, I'll give you whatever you want or give you what you need or something like that. But that's not the purpose. The purpose is to make a connection to them, and a well-crafted and a well-delivered personal story will most times, not every time, there will be exceptions, but in most circumstances, it will have that desired connection effect that you want it to have. But in answer to your question, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There isn't anything you can do in those circumstances.
Okay. And our next question here is, how many people have to advocate for these new therapies to be approved?
So there's no magic number. We employ something we call the layering effect when we utilize our advocacy tools. And the idea is to introduce and to execute a series of tools over a period of time, building and layering one on top of another. You don't need a lot of people. That's the truth. You don't need 2 dozen, 10 dozen, hundreds of people, or anything like that. What you need is a group of people who are sort of committed to getting this done, who are engaged in getting this done. And of course, we always have to remember that this is subject to people's health as well. Whenever we do advocacy in healthcare, we always have to remember that as patients and as caregivers, there will be times when people cannot engage because they have to take care of their health, and so they sort of may step away for a period of time and then come back and all that sort of stuff. So we're always very cognizant of that, and we reflect that, or we respect that, I should say. However, if you have a good core group of people, and sort of day in, day out, week in, week out, on and on and on, that core group of people is continuing to layer down these advocacy efforts, that's all you need. That's it. The one caveat to that is sometimes some of these tools involve grassroots work in which you want what we call volume. You're trying to get the maximum number of people to do something. A petition is a wonderful example of that. A petition that has 5 signatures is not worth doing. So in the case of a petition, you're going to want hundreds and hundreds and potentially thousands of signatures in order to have an impact, or have that particular tool as part of a layering effect have an impact on what you're doing. Well, the good news is it takes about 10 seconds to sign a petition. People don't need to devote any more than a minimum amount of time to do that. And so when we talk about those kinds of tools that do involve a larger push, a volume sort of exercise, we always make sure that those tools involve a minimal amount of time. But if we're talking about somebody who wants to write a letter, attend a meeting, do a bunch of other things like that, you don't need a huge group of people. You just need people who are committed to doing it, and who within a given jurisdiction are able to do that. As you know, the delivery of healthcare is a provincial matter, and so the essence of what we have to do, particularly as we enter this latter stage that we're going to talk about next week of these drugs being funded at the provincial level, is we need a certain or we need a critical mass of people in each province to some extent. And that is just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about that. Like I said, healthcare is largely the delivery of healthcare is largely the purview of the provinces. So there's nothing we can do about that. And so we always have to be cognizant of the fact that it isn't just about having a core group of people across the country. That's the starting point. It's also about having a core group of people, ideally in certain provinces or certain jurisdictions, who can then move forward within that jurisdiction to ensure that a medication, for example, gets funded in that particular province.
Okay. Thank you. And this is the final question of the evening that we have time for tonight. What kind of time commitment is necessary to become an advocate?
Joanne, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And definitely advocacy can be very labor intensive, but the great thing about the type of campaign that HAC has built, and we work with many different organizations to build, is a campaign where there are many different things that advocates can do, and they range in their time commitment. Because as Ryan said, we certainly realize, that many people have, less time, more time. It ranges, and even from day to day that can range. So you'll find, that in this work, there'll be choice. There'll be some activities that can take just a few, seconds, literally, to help you to engage in advocacy, and some that can take, many minutes, even days, to be involved with. So really, it's sort of how long is a ball of string. I mean, advocacy does require commitment, and that's the important thing, and it requires persistence. And so when we talk about time, that's really how we look at it, is the ability to stay engaged and to stay focused, but the individual activities can range, dramatically from being very, very quick to, taking a little bit longer, but still be equally as effective. I hope that answers that.
And so that concludes the time we have allotted for the question and answer portion of our webinar. If we weren't able to get to your question this evening, we'll do our best to follow up with you and provide an answer. And in the meantime, it's my pleasure to pass you back to Anne-Marie for some final comments.
Thanks very much, Rosalind. Thank you very much, everyone. And since there's no other questions, we will end by saying thank you to all that have joined us today. And we look forward to reconnecting over the next few weeks for webinar 2 and 3. Stay safe, be well, everyone. Good night.